Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Stevenson. I'm also a trustee of the International Catalogues Association. I would like to introduce the next panel, Pushing the Boundaries of Paper, Radical Approaches. The panelists are Claudine Grammont, head of the Cabinet d'Art Graphique at the Centre Pompidou, Paris, and Eric Robertson, professor of modern French literary and visual culture at Royal Holloway, University of London. And the panel will be moderated by Yuval Etgar, art historian and author of The Ends of Collage and Vitamin C+, Collage in Contemporary Art. Welcome, Yuval. Over to you.
Thank you. So it feels, having been here today, that we're going to basically turn everything we've said today on its head. So I apologize in advance to all the previous speakers. But really, Claudine and Eric, thank you so much for joining me and for also putting on a brave face, because hopefully this is the place where we can look at paper from a very, very different perspective to the one we've done so far. We're not going to talk about Nicolas Astrup, although I thought this was fascinating. Here we are. Yes. Look at that. So pushing the boundaries of paper, I suppose the title seems to be walking around the word collage and not really dipping into that, but for good reason. And that is particularly because we are going to talk about something wider, bigger perhaps, something that has been possibly wrongly or for different reasons been attributed to that term or under the umbrella term of collage, but has been associated with paper very, very closely in the last century. And I'm going to take the liberty to steal of your precious presentation's time, just a few minutes to set up maybe the lay of the land or the limits of our discussion now, because I think we're really treading on very complex, very versatile waters. And I'd like to start with the incredibly annoying Picasso, who never seems to get out of the point of holding all of the reins of the history of collage. The truth is that I chose this work to start off our presentation because I thought that this work is often falling outside the limit of that history. So typically, we speak of the history of modern collage within the context of modern art from 1911, 1912. We often speak of the still life with chair canning, or maybe of some of the works that Picasso and Braque are creating around those 2 years. And there's a very, very broad and long and exhausting discussion about who did what first. So if we are going down that rabbit hole, then there is this work that's always been disturbing a lot of historians, and it's called Le Rêve, the dream, much like the very much more famous painting that Picasso would do about 24 years later. But in this case, it's a tiny, tiny small work that's been made using a piece of wrapping paper, brown card paper from Magasin du Louvre, the big department store in Paris, which has been inverted upside down, and we can see the word Au Louvre, Paris, in the center of this collage, but upside down. And although this work was not pasted, was not glued, was not cut by Picasso, it does something very interesting, is that the Picasso clearly understands the edges of paper are so important to this work. He notices how amazing is the potential of this label, which he emphasizes the white, in which he creates the dream of which these two personas might be, or maybe the one that's lying down is thinking about. And he creates these two universes that meet each other by really thinking about the found materials of the most ordinary kind that he finds. So there is possibly a little precursor to what we see coming 3 or 4 years later. But Picasso has this this sentence that collage historians really love. There's about 3 of us. And that sentence is, "I've always seen collage." And the sentence itself, the argument itself, has been interpreted in different ways. Is Picasso saying, "I've always seen collage," because what he's talking about is that he's always seen things through the prism of breaking things into pieces, of putting them together? Is that why we see this kind of cubist development in his work? Is what he means really a very literal argument? And often this has been the case where it's been argued that when Picasso grew up in Malaga and La Coruña, one of the things he would see very often in the homes were figurines that people would do often with their children who's gone to battle or gone to war or gone to military, would have replaced the head of the figurine of the saint of a specific kind. But in general, a kind of practice that seems to have been connected to a different world that the art history, the modern art history has been rejecting very much, which is the word of craft, the world of accomplishments, all kinds of terms that seem to have been very, very wrong to use within the context of modern art for a long time. For example, this is a century before Picasso, and we can go a millennium before Picasso thinking about these things. But this is, for example, Louise Dutenhofer, a German phenomenal silhouettist who's not only managed to establish herself all of the criteria that one would demand from an artist, a market, clients, exhibitions, ways to create provocative and unexpected knowledge or content. But moreover, Louise Dutenhofer is an artist whose use of paper is phenomenal. These paper-cut silhouettes are all done with a free hand, with any kind of thing that holds. They're not done with a scalpel, they are done with scissors. And I'll get to in a minute why am I telling all of these stories. Another example, which is also falling outside those margins, and from the very, very same period, 1803, this is Moses Williams, who became known as cutter of profiles. Perhaps one of the first black African-American artists whose work we see entering the realm of art history by merit of a very unusual circumstance with his slave owner at the time, who admitted him into the family to a certain degree, who gave him the skill of working in his museum and making these silhouettes for visitors, but gradually found his way into a cataloging, into a history of collage by way of actually signing this piece together with Raphael Peale, who was kind of his patron, you would say, and who later his story is long. The extents of where collage begins really are very, very complicated. And one of the most interesting bits of knowledge we have emerges from around the 1930s, where the first theoretical accounts of collage start coming into place and of cutting papers, much thanks to one person who we'll talk about in a minute, Louis Aragon. But for example, the experiments at first are really not even known to the practitioners themselves, whether they are or whether they don't qualify within the realm of art, of fine art. This example from approximately 1911, a photograph from the studio of Georges Braque that depicts this incredible corner piece that he does, a three-dimensional paper-cut sculpture. But interestingly enough, this sculpture is deemed by Braque himself possibly a step too far, and he goes on to destroy it. The other person who was still always around the corner to see it was probably Picasso, who went on and did these incredible guitar sculptures we all know and remember. The range of materials we're about to explore when we talk about this practice, and here comes the problem of what we said of turning maybe the very delicate balance of connoisseurship and scholarship of paper on its head, is where we start seeing that everything that these artists who are working during the 1910s and 20s, but even before them, are doing is precisely those things that were deemed as faults into the artwork previously, and maybe hints to the detectives who then seek to use them as a way to discover what we can do with paper. So Fabienne spoke earlier this morning so wonderfully about the oil stains, about the tears on the edges, these faults, these marginalized pieces of information that we all like to then find as details and suddenly discover so much. Here they become the tools. Here they become the center stage of a certain practice that we are looking at. And for example, we look at someone like Hannah Höch, who very early on develops an entire new way of working with images, of collating them, of bringing them together in an almost encyclopedic way, and certainly, despite Dada's great claims, not by chance, not by mistake, and they have a huge amount of information compressed into a picture like this one, cut with a kitchen knife, which is such a great feminist argument to be putting into art history in 1919, cut with a kitchen knife, Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch in Germany, in which we can divide this collage into 4 pieces and start talking about the way that she really catalogues a certain historical moment. I'm going to give one more example before we dive into the presentations and the reason we are having this conversation. And this is Max Ernst, who also does quite an incredible gesture towards the end of the 1910s, where he explores new horizons in the use of paper. But unlike most of his colleagues who were tearing and cutting immediately, Ernst found that the materials he was working on were so fascinating in their own right that they didn't need anything but a bit of embellishment by way of painting or coloring over an existing catalogue of images, of shapes, of colors. Or in another case, this is a brilliant piece that Max Ernst called Students in Heidelberg. What we see here, like with many of Max Ernst's collages, is an attempt to do something that looks like a lot of work has been put into it, while in fact, Max Ernst found this in the newspaper, an article about different ways of whistling with using your fingers, and what he only did is add these 2 very unusual, strange stamps lying at the bottom of the picture. Their explanation is very hard to tell. Perhaps something that has to do with joysticks, with I always think about horns of bicycles when you imagine the title Students in Heidelberg. But moreover, what he does is simply change the title. So papers, widely distributed in the early 1910s and 1920s, suddenly provide artists with a huge range of new materials that were deemed outside the range of what they were allowed to do. The newspaper, the caption, the photographic image, all of these things that we see, the packaging material, all comes in, and from the edges comes into the center of a new activity. Before the last thing then maybe I want to put forward here as we start is precisely this image, which Sarah would know very well, has no paper into it other than a depiction or a painting of paper. This is René Magritte, 1927, just the year that Magritte arrives in Paris and discovers and meets all these incredible people like Max Ernst. And he makes this beautiful painting in which he uses a paper cutout, but not a real one, to create the illusion of concealment, but also the sense of cataloging and distinction in his own work. Now, I'm showing this picture because there is a very interesting comment that comes up a few years later, in 1930, when the supposedly first exhibition of collage, which is kind of deemed that, takes place in the Galerie Grammont in Paris, and it's called Le Peinture au défi, in defiance of painting, or the challenge to painting, in which a lot of the works that are included also are very, very close to painting. But within this context, Aragon writes a very long and very important historical or first revision theoretical thinking about collage and its breadth. And he writes the following: I don't know whether Braque or Picasso was the first, perhaps desperate for materials, to use wallpaper, newspaper, or postage stamp as found to complete or begin a painting which must have made the dilettantes tremble. And I skip a bit forward, and then he says, though, from those first works issue 2 utterly distinct categories of work. One, where the element pasted on is valued for its form, or more precisely for its representation of the object, and the other, where it is employed for its material. It is certain that the latter constitutes nothing more than a pictorial work where a problem of color is at issue, where everything comes down to an enrichment of the palette and at times a critique of the palette, a quip. By contrast, the former anticipates the collage to come, where the express triumphs over the manner of expression, where the object depicts plays the role of a word. Now, for Aragon, collage, and this is the moment we're abandoning the word papier collé, which was associated with Cubism, for the word collage. So for Aragon, this moment sets free this new type, Dada, surrealism, in which the object depicted or it plays the role of a word, a concept, an idea. We see figurative cutting, no longer the straight line cuts of constructivist or futurist or cubist collage, but actually something that feels a lot more like the surrealist or Dadaist. We see parts of hands, we recognize pieces, we build weird sentences by bringing these works together. The two guests that are here today to make presentations for Matisse and for Arp's sake are really working against Aragon in a way. Because Aragon's claim is exactly precisely thinking about paper in a way that's completely conceptual. Yet it is clear to us today, looking backwards, that there was certainly not just a use of paper in abstract collage, in the practices in which people painted and created forms and used the materials to think exclusively of something as an enrichment of the palette. So it is with great, great excitement that I hope that maybe you can provide us some introduction to the practices of these two artists who work really on the edges of what cutting papers can produce and how do we even think about cataloging or thinking about building the right categories to understanding this work within a context of a catalog. Claudine, would you like to start?
So next. So thank you. Indeed, the Matisse paper cutouts are not collage. And not at all. Well, in fact, they had to become collage, but in terms of materiality, they had to be mounted. Because when they went out of the studio, they were mounted, and then they were glued. But their inner property was to be free. So just a few words to introduce them and to let you know what exactly is a cutout. So this technique, Matisse first used this technique at the end of his career. He was almost 80-year-old. And you see him here, it's just caption of a movie from Frédéric Rossif. It's a color movie, which is very rare at that time. And I choose these photographs because you can see that here the material is these are large sheets of paper, and Matisse had them colored with Linel gouaches first by an assistant. He had 3 or 4 assistants in the studio by that time, and then he cut directly into colors with very large scissors, which must be very heavy. In fact, I never find these scissors. I don't know where they are, but they must be in the family somewhere. And so you see, you have that sheet of paper. He had them colored. There were many. The range of colors from Linel was quite wide, and so he cut. And sometime the assistant was turning the page, and for him when it was large, and then you can see that the shape is very soft, and it doesn't have any direction. You can look at it in any direction possible. And there are 2 shapes indeed. There are the positive and the negative one. And Matisse was working with these 2 shapes. And so this was the very first step. But the second step, you cannot see it there, but the second step is pinning. So first step, cutting, and then pinning. Pinning means that he used these shapes either in very small format, either in very large composition. But in both ways, he pinned them on a background paper or directly into the wall. That means that why did he pin them? Because he could unpin them. He could remove the pin. So this is this is really what he wanted to do. This is something that is not fixed at all. And when he was, let's say, for example, working on this composition, The Chief, which is now in Los Angeles, this composition was worked directly on a background paper in the studio at La Regina. But this was one of the many composition he tried for a commission he had from Frances and Sidney Brody for their patio in Los Angeles. So this is a maquette for a ceramic. And when working on this whole commission, so he tried different solutions. And in another, let's imagine it was worked in the South studio. There were 2 studios at La Regina. And then he decided to move it to another room. So and to work in something else in the room. And for all the photographs that we have from that period, there are many of them, then we understand that things are always changing in the studio. Sometimes there is that composition in Washington, and then it's something else, and again something else. So this is really moving all the time, and not a collage at all. But then, and these, well, second thing, important thing is these are maquettes for something, but sometime when he was working on small format, directly on the wall also, these were work from their own right, I mean, and not maquette for a commission or anything else. But the reason why he was using cutouts at the very first ends, it was because Matisse was an artist who really wanted to work full size. Let's say, for example, the very first time he used a cutout was for the dance in 1930, for the commission for Barnes. And he had to work the dance for Barnes is 13 meters long and 3 meters high. And so he started to work only painting, and then he had to redo the whole composition. So it was terrible. I mean, he just said, well, what am I doing? And then he had this idea of having someone prepare large sheets of colored papers with the 5 colors he was using for the dance composition. And then started to cut these papers in order to put the figure in the ground and work on this for a year. And if you look closely at the photographs who shows the work in progress, there are hundreds of papers. All the figures in the composition, all the bathers, they are done with, we didn't count them, but there are many of them, and most of them were pinned. So just to let you know that it was really just like really a moving process. And when André Masson was one of the very few artists who had the possibility to see the work in progress for the dance, he said that it was really just like a monster who will maybe kill the artist. But because this lasts for 3 years, because there were 3 versions and so on. So just to let you know that this is it's a work, the very definition of a cutout, that's something which is a work in progress, and it's not glued, and it's not a collage. Mm-hmm. Well, it was very short, but maybe we can discuss more about this after. We can. And I leave you the next things.
Thank you. Well, did you want to?
Oh, maybe that image, because that photograph is important, because you can see Matisse cutting his sheets of paper, cut out gouaches, and there's all these shapes, all around. But we will. It was all the shapes that you can see on the floor. They were kept, they were gathered, kept, and he was using them again for another composition. And maybe we will talk about this later on, about these cutout elements, because these are important, in fact.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll be focusing just on Arp, who had two names, Hans and Jean, because he was a native of the Franco-German border territory that is Alsace. The first slide takes us to Zurich in 1915, which was around the time that Dada was coming into being. And Arp exhibited alongside Adja and Otto van Rees. The exhibition included tapestries and embroideries, and Arp had designed tapestries which Adja van Rees and her friends wove for him. He also exhibited some collage works, and I'm particularly interested in the text that he wrote for the catalogue, a part of which is on the screen. These works are an attempt to go beyond the human and get closer to the eternal, the inexpressible. They keep a hostile distance from egotism, their hatred of the immodesty of human baseness, hatred of images, of paintings. And that hatred of images, and presumably he's mostly thinking about figurative images, although maybe not just, can extend into the work that he did in isolation and with his partner Sophie Teuber, whom he met on the occasion of that exhibition I just mentioned at the Galerie Tanner in Zurich in 1915. You can see how they would have found in each other kindred spirits, you know, their cynicism towards, as it were, the hierarchies of so-called fine art versus applied arts. And so here we find them using not scissors, but using a paper cutter, because they wanted, such was their striving for a kind of anonymity and a kind of a lack of ego, that even scissors, Arp has written about this, even scissors betrayed the presence of the human hand, and that was something that he really fought hard to avoid. Paradoxically, around the same time, that's to say, well, in this case, 1916, 1917, we find a different trajectory that's beginning. This is a very early example of that rather more, you might say, disruptive tendency in his work that goes completely against the kind of pristine perfection of those clean lines, where, as you can see, he's torn the paper. And I mean, the name that this work acquired, and it's not entirely clear when it got that work, but it has been hailed as the beginning of what he termed the laws of chance. And so, as Yuval was saying earlier, you know, the degree to which chance is actually being implemented here is another question. In fact, Hans Richter, fellow Zurich Dada member, wrote about this in terms of this mythical discovery of chance. Arp just let the sheets of paper drop and he glued them where they lay. Manifestly, this was not made in that way, as quite a lot of ordering has clearly gone on. But it is nevertheless interesting that he is invoking chance as a kind of principle, creative principle here. This is just this was done, a series of prints done with, well, for Kurt Schwitters and his Merz label, so to speak. And it's quite interesting because the prints themselves that Arp made are very clean lined and very pristine, and this cover that he designed, this frontispiece, is something of a hybrid between the clean lines of the cut paper and the rather more ragged lines of the tear. But the torn paper came into his work in a much more systematic way at the end of the 1920s. This has been linked to different factors, one of which was the death of his mother in that year, Another that has been posited is that he found a number of his works which had been in storage and they had been badly damaged. And again, it's one of these myths, if you like, but I think there's probably a lot of truth in this. And he, after a period of despair, he came to accept and even embrace the principle of the death, what he calls the death of the image. So he actively welcomed the deterioration. And in this example, he used quite fibrous paper. Hopefully you can see that as he tore it, it left little traces, little flecks of the fibrous paint and paper. And the glue that he used also, he didn't mind if the paper moved a little, so the glue sort of sealed those fragments, those frays in place. These are the terms in which he described this. The death of the picture no longer made me despair. In creating the picture, I began to try to incorporate its disappearance and its death and included them in the composition. And Bryony Ferr has written very nicely about these torn paper works of the 1930s, and she argues that rather than giving us a kind of enhanced, well, she refers to the fact that ARP was, like as was Kandinsky at that time, an avid reader of his encyclopedia. What we're not getting, though, is a kind of clarity. What we're getting, rather, is what Bryony Ferr describes as an exaggerated form of perception which makes visible, as a microscope might, that which is invisible. So it's almost as if this opens up kind of another realm beyond that which would be perceptible to the naked eye. Another kind of subcategory of the torn works is the torn drawing. And I mean, in terms of a catalogue raisonné, this poses interesting questions in terms of what is the original and what is the unique work, and how you handle these in terms of cataloguing and so on. And he did destroy a lot of his work, but he did then reconstruct some of his earlier drawings, such as this one. And he would, of course, rename, you give the work a new name, a new identity. He did this and other similar works during the Second World War, when he and Sophie Teuber were living with Alberto Magnelli in Grasse in the south of France. And through a lack of access to artist materials, he rescued some of that brown wrapping, paper that you would use to wrap up parcels. Allegedly, he rescued some of that from the waste paper basket, flattened it out, but then used the crumples as the basis of a work of art. So the crumples would dictate the lines that he would end up painting. And so once again, there's a kind of built-in frugality about the materials that he's using, but also the role of chance plays a very important role here. And rather poignantly, after Sophie Teuber's death of carbon monoxide poisoning, when they were staying at Max Bill's flat, that was early 1943, Arp was unable to work for quite a long time, and then when he resumed his creative activity, he did so by tearing papers. And interestingly, intriguingly, and rather poignantly, some of those papers were drawings by Sophie Teuber, and in this case, a drawing that he and Sophie had done together. So it's a sort of desperate, poignant attempt to continue their collaborations some time after her death. And just as a little finisher, in 1936, on pretty much at this very address, certainly this street, in 1936, in the International Surrealist Exhibition, a very unusual work by Arp was exhibited. It's the last one on the ARP list there. I don't know if you can see it, the name. It was just called a very, very perfunctory name, Object in Newspaper, not given a kind of, if you look on the right column there, oils are given a medium, a definition of medium or object. This one isn't even given a definition in terms of its medium. Back in 1936, I'm sure it was not quite so scatological looking. It would have been much paler in colour. But here we have him using, again, a very frugal, very ordinary, so to speak, non-artistic material in a very unconventional way. And interestingly, again, from the catalogue raisonné point of view, that name changed a year later when the same piece was exhibited in Paris, and it was renamed after these two words that appear on the newspaper headline, mutilé et apatride, mutilated and stateless, which in a way, I'm sure it relates to him as a Franco-German on the eve of another world war, but also to the kind of indeterminate state of these artworks. I think that's my last slide, so I'll hand this back to the boss before I get thrown off the stage.
Fantastic. I think maybe we can start by talking a little bit. You've both done a great deal of research into the work of these artists, and as you say, exactly, Claudine, this is not collage. Their work falls within categories that are often very, very hard to define. But there are also categories that require a different set of tools in order to research. And I wonder if either of you would like to say something about how one would, what would you have, particularly as neither of these artists currently have an updated catalogue raisonné addressing these bodies of work. What would be the categories? Could you imagine the categories of the cataloguing to be different from those usually attained of the usual medium, etc., etc.?
First of all, if I can answer for Matisse, I will come back. So, indeed, the catalogue raisonné of the cutout doesn't exist, but the catalogue raisonné of the painting doesn't exist as well. So, but in fact, usually the 1977 catalogue, an exhibition catalogue, is considered not to be a catalogue raisonné, but to provide the full list of the 218 cutouts that exist. Maybe some of them have appeared before, within that time. But for me, if there would be a category, the first one would be, of course, what should we do with the cutout elements that weren't used in a composition? That is to say, these elements that were given by the family to the two Matisse's museum in 217 or 11 or 211. So these are 800 elements so these kind of sheets of papers that Matisse kept in his studio, and it was his tool. It was his colors, languages, forms, everything he could imagine with his cutout forms that were everywhere and very imaginative. And so these were kept and given. And they were given, but of course these are not inventoried as works of art. There are documentation to document the works, to document, for example, these are very useful to, as they stayed in the drawers for many, many years, the colors are intact. So these are useful. So in terms of the catalogue raisonné, I would introduce them in the catalogue raisonné, but in a different section. Mm-hmm. And the rules that the family gave to the museum, I can tell, the rules are you can't lend it to any other institution, and you cannot show them next to another artist. I had at the Museum Matisse in Nice the example with David Hockney, who had a show with us, and he came, and the idea was to do something with him and the cutouts, but the family said, no question. It is only something that is to be considered as a document for the rest of the works of the cutouts. And maybe there could be sections because there are works that really works on their own and works which depend to commissions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe so maquette for a commission. There are some examples there. So these are maquettes for ceramic. These are maquettes, for example, when he worked on the Vence Chapel, he did all the stained glasses. So they could be maquette for stained glasses. This on the left is the maquette for the house that Thériade had in Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, or maquette for the chasubles. These are maquettes for ceramics. So it could be, I think it would be very easily categorized this way. Well, that could be an idea.
Is the distinction clear? And maybe you can say a word about when and why the transition happens where these supposed maquettes become also used as a technique to actually make works that he considers as artworks independently.
When exactly this happened? So it's obviously happened with jazz. Where jazz is the first, well, he conceived 20 plates for jazz during the war. This was edited after the war. And I think this is the very first book he did with paper cutouts. And the first time he really used them as a maquette for a finished work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very, I was talking about the cutout as a tool for working full size, which happens most of the time. But this time the book is not that large, but this time it was because Matisse was extremely demanding regarding color reproduction. We all know about that because it's still the case from the Matisse's hairs. So he found that solution to work with the lineal gouaches and found and had them there. He was using a pochoir stencil to do the album. So, but these were the same colors, so no problems of color reproductions.
Although we do see a return, there is more than one maquette in that instance, because Matisse receives the first edition, he adds, he's not happy with all of the colors, and this is something we now see, for example, speaking of maquette versus a finished work, circulating in the market.
Yes, but this is another maquette appeared. But usually Matisse was having, for example, let's take the example of Frances and Sidney Brodie. He had a contract, and so they had most of the commission. They had to buy the maquette and the finished work, and the maquette has to go to a museum. Mm-hmm. It was very strict, right? And this is the case for the chief. They are all in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So he was very clear with that. If you purchase or a cutout, a composition made with cutout, you buy the cutout and you buy the ceramic, or you buy. But you have to have the two. For the chapel in Vence, so he kept the maquettes. Mm-hmm. And the sister had they made all the chasubles themselves.
Okay. So before we go into exactly the question of pinning, I would like to hear, Eric, what do you think are the problems with ARP? We speak again, there are the similar issues of mobility, of movement in his work, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yes, attempts have been made to produce catalogue raisonné of his work. There was one done in 1981 by Hans Rau, which was of the reliefs. And then in 2012, there was, it makes it clear that it's not a catalogue raisonné in this case. The 2012, one of his sculptures, because it's a complicated story. There are 3 ARP foundations, one in France, one in Germany, one in Switzerland, and 2 of the 3 didn't give their permission for this very substantial volume of his sculptures that was done in 2012. But it is nevertheless a very complete record. And interestingly, that last one that I showed you, the newspaper object, which might be a relief or it might be something else. Well, at one time it was deemed a surrealist object, which was a category all of its own. That makes it into the 2012 volume of his sculptures. But in all sorts of ways, I mean, also in 1981, when the relief catalogue raisonné came out, was effectively the equivalent for his poems, done in 2 volumes by a scholar called Emmy Blycast and published with Grant and Cutler, no longer with us, but in Great Marlborough Street. Fantastic and so useful, but that too is forever pointing you in the direction of other works. And this is something that you find with Arp. He himself deliberately creates confusion by referring to his own work with incorrect titles or mixing things up. He clearly enjoyed making things a little bit difficult for the scholars in the room. But yes, I mean, also if you think of his reliefs, for instance, many of them made with cardboard, it would be difficult to prove in a court of law that they are reliefs because, basically they involve nothing more than a cutout in some cases. So does that make a work a relief if there isn't more than one surface? If there's basically a surface with a hole cut in it. So I think in terms of identifying the category of work, you're on difficult ground, frankly, with Arp much of the time. Also, he famously would saw up some of his earlier plasters in order to make new ones, and so many works share the same elements. Also, the plaster for him was just as viable a material for a sculpture as, let's say, marble. And so the plaster sculptures, in his eyes, were of the same aesthetic value. So, what is the finished work? What is a sort of maquette in preparation for another? It's not always easy to say.
Yeah. To take this one step further, I mean, I think one of the problems we're looking at here is also the technical question. I think often in catalogues of paintings and drawings, we're used to a very limited vocabulary that is certainly not always sufficient, but has some kind of standards in it. The question of whether, for example, the type of tools that are being used in the making of these works, you speak of his very large scissors in particular, which, in the history of the context of what we're talking about, tearings, working with scalpels, working with scissors, thinking about edges, thinking about glue. I think glue has been a kind of an overlooked aspect in the history of collage, but an incredibly important one. Conservators are now experiencing the problems of a century of experiments in different types, of the effects this have on paper. And I suppose we are looking at a time in history where we're going to start writing more and more catalogues of artists whose practices have huge material complexity. And I think paper alone brings to itself a huge task. I've shown Max Ernst earlier. I think Werner Spies did an incredible project that isn't deemed a catalogue raisonné, but is shown in his largest book on collage, where he identified the sources. To what extent do these sources have a place within the catalogue raisonné? In cases you mention have perhaps another artist work being used or a collaboration. In other cases, these materials are so essential to the DNA of the work, but then to what extent can a catalogue go to these lengths of speaking of these things? I think in Matisse's case, we also have the problem of or the very interesting aspect of where the pins were located, how these were moving and mobile, and maybe imagining or understanding their positioning through that. I I wonder if there are any other technical specific things, and maybe particularly I'm curious about the use of paint or coloring papers, whether that has been something that you find is hard to determine or has the, because in both cases the materials are often made and prepared, right?
Well, in the case of Matisse, it's quite well, it starts to be quite well documented, because there are quite a lot of research. Research is done by some museums everywhere. Well, MoMA made a large deep research on the swimming pool, and there's been something at the Bayeler Foundation, and des accounts, and in the Musée Matisse we had this research on the large cutout, but there could be more. I think there could be it would be really interesting to share all this research. I really would like to to launch a program on the cutouts, and to share any possible knowledge that we have. The major problem being, of course, conservation problem and issues on how these gouaches are fading, because they are fading, and the research maybe would be also useful not only to better know how it will fade and how quick it will fade, but to let anyone know, and people in the museum know that if we keep them on the wall, they won't exist anymore within 50 years. They are fading. Anyway, they are fading. Each time you show it on the wall, it's fading. So what could be done? And as for the holes, and yes, there are a lot of now there are a lot of microfading process, and now for the holes we can map, and it's possible to map and to understand how the whole process of the construction of and sometimes it's very complicated.
I bet.
It is. It is because some if you take a blue nude, it's the easiest example. There are 4 blue nudes. The fourth one, which is the La Matrice, there are maybe I don't know how many of them. This has to be studied. There are at least 20 blues, different blues, and the 3 other ones. These were done in one go, and it's only one blue. Okay, he took the sheet, cut, and done. But the blue, the number 4, which is in fact the first, this has to be studied. Yeah. Well, it's one case among many others.
Eric?
Well, thinking about some of these real sort of technical difficulties in even just identifying a material or how it's been used. The very sort of fibrous black on white papier déchiré, torn paper that I showed you earlier, the Tate caption refers to the fact that ARP dipped white paper in ink to make those. I have heard from another source that it was actually black paper. So there are certain sort of ambiguities that one would have to really probably use at least a very good magnifying glass, if not digital optical technologies, to get a clear answer to. But there are a lot of suppositions or perhaps not absolutely accurate facts. So I think that there's definitely room for a very thorough study. Just thinking about something that you've said earlier in terms of the sort of the bits that Matisse, the sort of the edges that Matisse of the papers that Matisse had cut out. So if he's cutting a leaf, the bits around the edge, the status of those. You get me thinking about an experience I had when I was in Locarno at one of the 3 foundations, the one that was named after Arp's second wife, Marguerite Hagenbach, Marguerite Arp. And the then curator just opened a drawer in the studio. You can access his studio, his working space. So the curator opened a drawer and took out a piece of paper. I mean, it was full of cutouts, you see. Now, what's the status of those? Did they constitute works in their own right? I know that Arp used to play around as if, playing a board game where he would take some torn or cut papers, move them around and have a look. Well, what is the status of those elements? On the same occasion, and this appealed to me as a scholar of his poetry, out came a shopping list written in Arp's hand. It was great. It was, bicycle trouser clips, clothes pegs, and then this line in French, in his hand, les étoiles, les larmes de l'infini. The stars, the tears of the infinite. And then he goes on with the shopping list. And it's just incredible. What's the status of that piece of paper? Is that a poem? Is that a sort of, cut up poem? So all these questions, unanswerable questions, are really interesting.
Yeah, that certainly goes back precisely to a practice that relies so much on the everyday, on the found, on the material that has usually been exactly, discarded. I'll open the floor if there's any questions for Eric or Claudine. Wait, the microphone is coming.
The exhibition of Matisse's drawings and sculpture at the Hayward Gallery in the mid-1980s. And I remember going to first to Lydia de la Stercaya's flat in Montparnasse, but also with John Golding and John Elderfield to the Matisse Foundation. And I remember her being already aware that these negative pieces were there in quantity. When I've gone recently to Le Cateau, they certainly mount them. I don't know who decides, but they certainly have them on walls, don't they? Some of the, basically the negatives, the remains. And I don't know whether, how they make decisions about curious whether you can say more about how they make decisions about which ones to do and what patterns to put them in, such as those.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So these were, yes. Well, each time, let's take an example. You see the shape, this shape, for example. So this was on its own. Yeah. Okay. So in first, it has been put. It's glued, but very thinly. It's in terms of conservation, it's perfect, right? But as soon as you position this way, you create something. and plus, if you take the four of them and you put them together, you create something else. I mean, it's very. So I wouldn't have done that. I mean, and yes, but it's wonderful. It's wonderful, but maybe it's not very fair with the author, with the authorship. And maybe the most proper way would be to have drawers. You were talking about a drawer, because there were in drawers. So just open the drawer and see all the shapes. Because some of these shapes, some are that size, some are that size. And it's really miraculous, to see all of them. They are really, really lively. They are wonderful. The colors are bright. It's just like if you open a jazz that has never been opened, you are blown away. I mean, it's really something. It's really something, because jazz is always presented on the wall.
Even in the 1980s, when the Blue Nudes came to the Hayward, I remember we were shocked because they came from Jean Matisse, one of them, and the Perspex frame was sticking to the Blue Nude itself. It had already been had a hard life for 30 years.
You know that most of the cutouts have been mounted after Matisse's death. Yeah. Most of them, yeah. And but that I remember that there is something about Aimé Mag had this wonderful idea of, but it never happened. Let's take the cutouts and do installations. We take the shapes, we have them mounted, and then we disinstall the thing. Isn't that the? I mean, it's great because you keep the first way they were created. I mean, the way they were floating in the air. I mean, they were, very light, and as soon as you mount them, you glue them, and they leave part of their life. But Maurice Lefebvre-Voinet he was selling a lot of material for all the artists at that time. But I don't know. I never had access to their archives. I mean, they demounted all the cutouts, and their archives must be precious. If there is a catalogue raisonné once, I mean, this is the place to go.
It's interesting because it also has such a connection to the fact that these artists have been cataloging their source material. And I think this is clear and easy when you look at Max Ernst and you see all these pictures he took from encyclopedias, but Matisse was doing it as well. There was all these are the samples, these are the attempts, this is the vocabulary. It's, it's the whole vocabulary. Please.
Sorry, just to carry on from what Catherine was saying, I just had a basic question. The negatives, as it were, of the papier découpé, how did Matisse himself regard that? Did he regard it as part of the general mélange of what he was playing with, both positive and negative, or did he see what was left behind, in other words, the negative, as something which was, to a certain extent, not part of an artistic project? In other words, what is its status?
Yes, that's a good question. But because sometime he was using, there are compositions where in two different compositions, which are in two different museums, you can see two parts of the same paper, which has been cut into two, the positive and the negative. There should be a large research on that. If anyone is interested,
come see me.
Come. I mean, I would be very pleased. But clearly, I think that he wanted all the shapes that stayed in the studio to be destroyed. And the family did that for the plaster, for the sculpture. They destroyed all the plasters. Claude Dutry did that. So maybe that's a little sad, and the fact that they gave them to a museum is wise. I mean, they are there and they are kept for research, and it's a really great material for research. There are a lot to do, really a lot to do with these forms, with these shapes, a lot. Still.
Just one final supplement. Do the negatives have the pin marks?
Oh, yes.
Like the positives do?
Yes, yes.
So he was playing with them as part of a compositional exercise?
Exactly. There's no difference between the negative and the positive, and the question of the finished or unfinished work is, of course, central in Matisse's work until the beginning of his life, of his career, and then and of course the maquette is that finished or unfinished work. That's a whole question, but I would leave it for another talk.
I have a question. As a living artist, I have to be engaged in the vulgar business of actually making money to pay rent and staff and look after loved ones and all the rest of it. Is there consideration that you take that perhaps something like the small composition that the artists made using 4 of the cutouts here could be gifted to a loved one to look after them in the coming years after the death of the artist. And if you look at this as an artist might gift artworks to loved ones to take care of financial needs going on, and in that way, the small circle of friends and family and loved ones around the artist and the artist's estate, somehow the worst thing that could possibly happen to that group of people is the discovery of 500 small pieces in a drawer somewhere, which the artist had failed to destroy. I spent a lot of time destroying artworks. I probably destroyed more artworks in the last 5 years than I've made, by a lot. Is that something that, when the family estate is looking after the catalogue, is there a differential in if it's somebody else taking care of the estate or the family taking care of the estate? Is there a vested interest? How do you consider the financial impact on the artist's estate when making a surprise discovery? Is there wishful thinking, oh, look, we found 500 more of these things? How does that devalue individual artworks? And how much consideration do you take of the implied intent and wishes of the artist, living or deceased?
Long question. I hope I understood you well. I'm sorry. Well, in that case, this is the family, clearly, with work. It's the family, the estate, the Matisse heirs that are in charge of the catalogue raisonné and all. They decide everything. And I don't know how to answer you. Which one? Yeah. What is the question exactly?
I think it would be hard. It would be hard to determine this.
Yes. I have an answer. I have an answer because what happened is that some of these composition, of course, they went to the market. They went out of the studio. At the beginning, there were. I don't reveal anything. There were thousands of them left in the studio, and the 2 museums they receive 400 each. So that means that there are hundreds of them. I don't know where. That means that you can look at ArtNet or something like that, and you will see that there are some of these shapes that went to the market. I don't know how, I don't know why, I don't know when.
None of them, can go to the market and be sold without the family being happy about them being sold. Let's clarify this.
Yes, so this is perfectly clear. So, yes, of course.
So the family has been aware, somehow authentified them, so they haven't escaped the studio on the floor and been fed to the market. Because that's not possible. We can't sell them. Or some people in the market can. Serious people cannot.
So, I mean, this happened a long time ago, I guess, rather maybe in the 70s, a long time ago. I know that they are not considered as Matisse's work. Well, it's not a Matisse. It's not a Matisse.
I'm sorry, because we're running so much after time. And I want to thank you both extremely for coming and sharing this amazing body of knowledge. Thank you.